Hello, friends. My name is Pastor Jason. I am with the Susquehanna Conference. I am the benefits administrator for our conference, and I'd like to welcome you to a quick winter webinar here on completing the pastor's W-2. We are fortunate enough today to have Nancy Bunacore with us. Nancy is the clergy spouse of Sal Bunacore down in York, and she is also an incredibly talented H&R Block tax professional who specializes in clergy taxes. So she's here today to walk us through how to complete a pastor's W-2. So, you came to hear her. Without further ado, Nancy, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thank you, Jason. I appreciate this opportunity to share some information with our treasurers. Been doing this clergy spouse thing for over 30 years, and often our treasurers are volunteers, and they don't get a whole lot of assistance with some of these things that have to be done. So today I'm hoping to work us from our salary package form that is part of our annual conference charge conference paperwork to the W-2 for the pastors. What I'm sharing today would be good for any pastor salary, but I'm definitely wanting to address this toward our conference and our conference paperwork to make sure everybody's on the same page. Just a little about myself. I am a senior tax analyst with H&R Block. I also teach virtually for corporate H&R Block. I've been the last 2 years helping to train new tax professionals all over the country. And there is my contact information. I do need to say up front that this information today is just general information and it should not be relied upon as the only source of authority. And I also need to emphasize that this is not a presentation of H&R Block. I am an H&R Block employee, but this is not an H&R Block sanctioned presentation. So what we hope to accomplish this morning is I first want to make sure that we're all on the same page with the words we're using. Some of the words in our pastoral compensation package sounds an awful lot like IRS words, but they're not the same thing, and I want to make sure we understand our terminology. Then we're going to walk through the W-2 block by block to make sure you understand what goes where. I'm also going to share a little bit about other information your pastor needs to complete their taxes and address a few other issues with pastoral compensation. So let's jump in here. And first thing we got to do is define who the clergy is, because we have all sorts of titles we use in our church, like worship pastor or youth pastor. But not everyone who has pastor in their title qualifies for clergy under IRS rules. So when we're looking at clergy for IRS purposes, these are people who have been credentialed through ordination, commissioning, or licensing. A job title, just because you've hired someone to do some type of ministry position, does not necessarily qualify them for this clergy distinction. And if they do not have ordination, commissioning, or licensing, you would need to treat those individuals just as you would any other employee on your payroll. What we're looking at today are those folks who are clergy and so need to be treated as clergy for tax purposes. Clergy have a miserable situation in some ways. They are dual status before the IRS. They are considered employees for their federal income tax purpose, but for their self-employment purposes, the FICA taxes of Social Security and Medicare, they are considered self-employed. The church does not withhold the FICA taxes. They have to address all of that on their personal Form 1040 on the Schedule SE. Also, clergy can exclude certain income according to different rules. So with the clergy, when we're putting the package together and then translating that over into the W-2, it does create some different situations. Many churches use tax payroll preparers to put the W-2s together, but because of the unique situation with clergy, not everyone's familiar, and also then interpreting it from our documents, we need to make sure that we are clearly and correctly reporting the compensation so clergy can take advantage of the tax benefits, but also so they're not um, being handled inappropriately for their self-employment tax. So what you're seeing here on the screen is a clip from the charge conference pastoral compensation package in the middle of the front page of that charge conference form. This is where the actual salary for the pastor is reported and also what's proposed for the next year. This is our starting spot when we are looking at what the pastor receives in salary. Now you can see number C2 here says Social Security tax offset. There's a lot of confusion because of this wording. Somehow we think this is Social Security that's reported on box 2, or it's interpreted many different ways. Actually, what this is where the conference has laid out a way to help compensate pastors for the fact that they have to pay their own FICA taxes. This is available for those who are in the Social Security system. We do have some pastors who opted out of Social Security and they would not be eligible for this line too. But by and large, most of our pastors are eligible for this. And when the IRS looks at the salary of the pastor, they don't see the amount in line 2 as Social Security. They just consider that part of the cash salary, which is why our starting point is line 3 here, the Social Security and negotiated base salary added together. That is an internal United Methodist form to help come up with that salary number. So when we're looking at a W-2, and this is our example we're going to carry through here for Pastor Smith, that salary number that you have on the pastoral compensation form drop into box 1. Not everything in that salary, that is just a starting point. So we want to look at how we come up with box 1 from that starting point. So, as I said, the base salary and Social Security offset added together is our starting point for what goes into box 1. From there, we have to look at the health insurance premium salary reduction agreement. Each year, Jason sends out the numbers of what the pastor's contribution is to the health insurance and also HSAs and some other benefits that through our health insurance program for our pastors. And he also sends out a copy of a form that is the health insurance salary reduction agreement. What we're taking advantage of with this form, and here's a copy, I believe, of our most recent one. This is allowing us to actually reduce the salary before it's paid for the health insurance premiums, and also taking into consideration any of the HSA or other reimbursement accounts that are available through the program through our conference. If a pastor has completed this and the church has signed this before the beginning of the tax year, this amount gets subtracted from the salary because this agreement is making that non-taxable. It's basically reducing the salary, reducing our starting point. Hopefully, your pastor has filled this out. You do not send this anywhere. You as the treasurer need to keep this on file with your other payroll information and have this documentation on file. The other thing I should say about this form is it cannot be backdated. If you haven't taken care of this before starting to pay the salary, you can't adjust it afterwards. You're going to have to wait till doing it for the next year. This has to be agreed upon before the salary starts being paid. If you don't have that form, this is where you can go to on the conference website. You will find it under the Finance and Administration tab under health insurance in the area of forms, and you can see there circled health insurance premium salary reduction agreement. Also at the bottom of the screen there, I do have the actual link to go directly to that page if you do not have a copy of that form.
And Nancy, just to interject, those forms were sent out in the December health and pension billing. On December 15. They were pre-filled. So hopefully, God willing, the Postal Service was working. Everybody should have gotten those that they needed them.
Yes, so I'm hoping everyone got that done. That makes a big difference on the taxable income for the pastor. And that one form makes so much difference, and it's easy to ignore. You can't ignore it and you can't backdate it. So when we look at box 1, after we have our starting spot of the base salary and Social Security offset, we then will be able to subtract the amount from the health insurance premium salary reduction form. That whole amount would get subtracted as we're working to figure the box 1 amount. Now the next thing that would get subtracted from that number is the pastor's portion that is contributed toward their pension. Now, there's more than one type of plan a pastor can choose. They can choose to be part of a Roth 403B, and just like traditional versus a Roth IRA, the tax benefits for a Roth program come when you receive your distributions from the program. So if your pastor is doing a Roth program, this would not be subtracted out. But if they're doing the traditional 403B program, what is being contributed from their salary would also be subtracted out here. And also we'll see later it would get reported on box 12. Now at this point, it's a great place to double check your numbers, because what you have at this point should technically equal what you actually paid in cash to your pastor last year. These things would have been withheld, both of the above items we've talked about. So this should equal what the pastor was actually paid in cash. We're not ready though to put box 1 in yet, because we also have to look at if the pastor has a parsonage exclusion. On the second page of the charge conference form, down toward the bottom, item G2, when you were establishing the pastor's compensation package, you were able to determine if any of it would be considered parsonage exclusion for furnishings. There's a lot of confusion around this. Sometimes churches think they're paying the pastor extra if they put money into this amount. You're not. What you're doing is you are just designating that part of the salary is part of this exclusion amount for the pastor's parsonage expenses. With this amount, if an amount is approved, it is the pastor's duty to keep records and keep receipts to justify this number as an excluded amount. It is not the church's. The pastor does not return any or give any receipts to the church. It's part of their tax documentation. And if they have not spent the whole amount for parsonage on their taxes, it gets included back in as part of their salary. But that's the responsibility on their taxes. From the church's point of view, this amount on line 2G from the pastoral compensation package, the parsonage exclusion amount, needs to also be subtracted from that starting point. If your pastor is given a parsonage cash allowance in place of having a parsonage, this is not included in the box 1 figure. It will be detailed and noted in other places. So keep in mind that if your pastor has a cash allowance, that's something different from having a parsonage exclusion. Neither amounts, though, would be listed in box 1. So to get to that box 1 number, after we have our starting point of the base salary plus the Social Security offset, we subtract out the health insurance salary reduction. We subtract out the pastor's portion of pension if it's pre-tax. We subtract out the parsonage exclusion. And then if the church has paid any other amount to the pastor, like a gift, let's say the church collects a love offering and gives it to the pastor as a Christmas present, or maybe your pastor graduated from seminary and the church gave her or him a gift to honor their graduation. Anytime the church gives the pastor amount, a bonus, anything, that is considered salary by the IRS. So any other amount. Now, when I say other amounts, I am not referring to reimbursements. Reimbursements are not income. Reimbursements where the pastor has turned in mileage logs or turned in receipts is not part of income, and it wouldn't be included anywhere on the W-2 form. But any other amounts paid, like gifts, would need to be added in. And finally, we are at the box 1 of the W-2. I encourage you to work from this point for the rest of the W-2. When taxing agencies look at the W-2, they look between the federal wages, state wages, and local wages, and other items reported help make sense of those three numbers, especially if those three numbers are different. So we have box 1 now. The next box, well, before we move on to the next box, let's look at an example. Our example of Pastor Madison here, we can see her base salary was $45,000. Her Social Security offset was $3,442.50. So it gives us our starting point of $48,442.50. We have to subtract out her salary reduction. We have to subtract out her UMPIP contribution, I can say that, and also her parsonage exclusion. The church gave her no other gifts or money, so her W-2 box 1 would be this amount. And we can see that filled in here on a sample W-2 wage statement. The next box we look at is box 2. What federal income tax is withheld? Well, the reality is churches don't have to withhold federal tax for clergy. Clergy can do quarterly estimates, but it's an awful nice thing to do for your pastor that they don't have to do it, that you're willing to withhold an amount that they request. You would not use any formula like you would with a normal client. It would be best to have what the estimated taxes the clergy would be facing, because your clergy is going to be paying probably more in self-employment tax than they'd actually do in income tax, and need to have enough withheld to cover both of those. But again, it's not required to withhold the tax for clergy, but if taxes are withheld, you would want to put that amount in. Now, the next boxes we're going to be looking at are boxes 3 through 10. These are the other federal boxes. And I'd like to look at the form here to show you what we need to look at on these. With boxes 3, 4, 5, and 6, if this is a clergy W-2, these should be empty. The church never, ever withholds FICA taxes for clergy. Clergy pay that through their own Form 1040 with their self-employment tax. If the church has been withholding Social Security and Medicare tax, they need to correct that with the IRS, and they need to reimburse that to the pastor, because the church is not to be paying the FICA taxes. If you remember back to the beginning, clergy have dual status, and for the FICA tax purposes, they are self-employed. So there should never be any amount in boxes 3, 4, 5, and 6. Whenever I have a new clergy client and I see something there, that always lets me know we got to start with the W-2 before we can do anything else. Now, as we're looking at the W-2, box 7 and 8 would not apply to clergy unless you're giving your pastor tips when they have a good message, but I doubt you are. So box 10, though, may apply. If your clergy member has a reimbursement account for dependent care, that amount actually would need to go into box 10. when we are doing those tax advantage benefits through the health insurance programs, if it's for the dependent care part that they're able to use those funds, that does need to be reported in box 10. You would also have nothing for box 11, but we do need to look at box 12 then. Box 12 is where we start to show some of these tax advantaged plans. And what code that goes under here is dependent on what type of plan. If your pastor has the 403 traditional plan that has the tax benefits up front, their amount that they've contributed would be code E, and the amount actually contributed would need to be posted. Also, if they are doing a Roth 403B plan, then the code would be BB, and the amount would need to be posted. Another thing that more and more of our pastors are taking advantage of in the health plan is the health savings account. And if they are participating in the health savings account, the part that's being contributed from their salary should be reported in box 12 as code W. So those are the three main codes that I see us using with our pastors for their pension, and also if they are part of an HSA. So for our example of Pastor Madison does have the pre-tax code E UMPIP contribution, so it would show up in box 12 right here like this. The other thing we would want to note for Pastor Smith, which doesn't show, is we would want to put an X here in box 13 for a retirement plan. Now, a lot of times people like to check the statutory employee box. Pastors are not statutory employees. Please do not check that box. The only box in 13 that should be checked would be the retirement plan box if the pastor is participating in the retirement plan. Our next box on the W-2 is the box 14, or the other box. Technically, nothing has to be put in this box. A lot of churches approach this box many different ways. I have some recommendations of best ways to handle this. So, this would be my least preferred way. The pastor does need to know what the fair rental value of the parsonage is, and the pastor does need to know what utilities were paid for the parsonage. But those are not numbers that affect differences between these boxes, and they do not have to be reported to the IRS or any other tax authority. You could put these amounts in box 14, but I don't recommend it because they don't impact the other numbers. One important thing that I would do, though, if your pastor is receiving a cash allowance, I would put that parsonage allowance in under 14. Part of the reason for that is that amount's going to have to be added into box 1 for their state wages here in Pennsylvania, because that amount would be taxable to Pennsylvania. So to show why Pennsylvania's wages are going to be so much more than the federal, having this distinction that they receive the $14,000 in cash parsonage allowance would be very beneficial on the W-2. If they are not receiving the cash allowance, but they do have a parsonage exclusion allowance, I highly recommend that being put in box 14. And the reason for that is the parsonage exclusion allowance means that amount is not taxable to the federal government. It is also not taxable to our local Act 32 income tax. And so when you have someone who has a parsonage exclusion, they're actually box 1, box 16 for state, and box 18 are all going to be different. And this clarification in box 14 about that exclusion allowance for the parsonage would help clarify those numbers and save your pastor from having to send other documentation, especially to the local taxing authorities. Now we want to start looking at Pennsylvania. With Pennsylvania, we first want to start with our box 1 number, because We've subtracted a number of things out that are not taxable to federal, but they are taxable to state. We still do not pay anything because of that health salary reduction, because it's just what it says. It's a salary reductions that was determined before any salary was ever paid. So that's wiped out of the equation all the way. So start with your box one amount. But for Pennsylvania, you have to add back in pension that was subtracted. You have to add back in that parsonage exclusion. And you also have to add back in that cash parsonage allowance if your church pays that in place of providing a parsonage and utilities. All of these, any cash parsonage is taxable to Pennsylvania and needs to be considered part of the wages paid to the pastor. So for the state income tax, our state is a flat rate tax, 3.07. When you're doing the pastor's payroll, you want to make sure you figure from the beginning of the year what's going to be their actual amount, because their state amount's probably going to be the largest wage number of all three on their W-2. And hopefully you've been withholding PA state for tax for them. If you don't withhold taxes, I know some of our rural churches, their only employee is the pastor, and the pastor does estimates for all three levels, federal, state, and local. But again, if you withhold the PA state income tax, make sure you're withholding it against the correct amount for state wages. Here's our example of Pastor Madison. We had the box one number, but we add back in that pension and that parsonage exclusion. Pastor Madison doesn't have a parsonage allowance. So that gives us the PA wages. And then with our income tax rate, it tells us what should have been withheld. And here's our example of the W-2. You can see what's taxable to Pennsylvania is a lot more than what's taxable to federal. And hopefully we have actually withheld the 3.07% based on these box 16 wages. Obviously, if it hasn't, you would report what was actually withheld, and your pastor, when they do their taxes, will have to reconcile the difference. So that gets us through state. Now we need to look at local taxes. For our local taxes, again, we go back up to that box one amount, but this time the only thing we add back in is pension. For pension, the state of Pennsylvania and our local income tax, the Act 32 taxes, tax those pension amounts now as they are earned. They are not taxed later. That's very nice, because when you retire, you probably won't have to do a state and local return anymore. Actually, our local returns are only earned income. So you're not earning anything with the pension. But they're taxed up front, which is the opposite of federal. So you need to add that pension amount only. The parsonage cash allowance and parsonage exclusions are not taxable to local. And I have verified that multiple times with our local agency here. I'm in the York Adams Tax Bureau area. And with Act 32, those cash allowances and exclusions are not taxable. So if you're not sure what locality would be right to report for your pastor, you can always go to this this webpage of the municipal stats for PA. You would fill in their home address, because they pay based on where they live and not their work address. You would just, if you were filling in this form, put the home address in both places. And when you click view information, it would show you what is their address, their township, and its code. It would also show you the percentage that they would pay for their locality. So with our example of Pastor Madison, I put Pastor Madison here in Reading Township. And this would be how her W-2 would look. Her local wages are the box one plus the pension added back in. For this area, it's a 1.7 income tax. And of course, This would number 19 would reflect what was actually withheld and paid in. And then the locality name is that code that I got off the municipal stats site, which would reflect where Pastor Madison lives. So that is what we have to do to fill out the W-2. But that's not the only information your pastor is going to need to do their taxes correctly. They're going to need the fair rental value of the parsonage. This is actually set at charge conference and is part of the charge conference form. When you are looking at the charge conference form, if you remember back, and I showed you where we found the parsonage exclusion amount, item G1 is the fair rental value that's been approved by the church at charge conference. I would like to say about the fair rental value, you do not help your pastor when you set that number excessively low. If their taxes would ever be looked at and they would be audited, that would be questioned and could lead them to other penalties and problems. When you set a fair rental value for a parsonage, the best way to do that is to contact a real estate professional and ask them for a range for the actual parsonage that's provided. You don't have to call the fair rental value the top number, but it should fall within a true fair range for the fair rental value. The pastor needs to have this number because they have to include this in their self-employment taxes. You know, a lot of people say, oh, you get all this tax-free. No, they really don't, because they have to pay self-employment on it. Also, your pastor needs to know the amounts that were paid for all utilities. Utilities include such things as phone, electricity, gas, internet, cable, trash, water bills. It does not include any maintenance on the parsonage. That's not a utility. That's just you maintaining the property you own as the church. Some parsonages, unfortunately, have some of their utilities tied with the church or church buildings. I'd recommend if there was a way to change that, you should. It's not fair for the pastor to have to pay self-employment on utilities that are not actually to the parsonage. But you can't use that as a way to not include their percentage as part of their compensation that they do have to pay for utilities. Again, these two numbers, the utilities and the fair rental value of the parsonage, could go on the W-2. I really don't recommend it. I just would have those numbers available for your pastor for them to prepare their taxes. Again, also pastors who receive a cash allowance, that I do recommend reporting other under, because they would have to add that in for federal for their self-employment taxes. Now, there are a couple of other things that I would like to address just to clarify so you understand when you're working with your clergy member. Oftentimes, pastors receive honorariums for things like weddings or funerals, different things they do. And some pastors think, well, if I just sign this check over, if I endorse it and give it to the church, then it's not income for me. It's the church's money. Unfortunately, that's not how it works. A check made out to the pastor or cash given to the pastor as these honorariums, even if they immediately turn it over to the church, it is income they have to report. The church would treat that as a charitable contribution, and if the amount is more than $250, it needs to be noted with a receipt, whether it be the year-end statement or however your church handles receiving cash gifts of $250 or more. But the pastor cannot treat that like it's not their income by immediately surrendering it to the church. If it was made out to them or given to them in the form of cash, it's part of their self-employment. Another thing that some clergy think, they think they can do a salary reduction for their tithes and offerings to the church. Sorry. The church can ask, the clergy can ask the church to hold out their giving from their checks, but that is still taxable income. That is just a charitable contribution and you're just helping them do it. You cannot reduce the salary as a way to give the contribution to the church. That is not allowed. I mentioned this earlier, but anytime the church or even a church member gives any kind of gift to the pastor, it does affect taxes. Any kind of love offerings, the pastor actually needs to keep track of any gift cards. So, when you give them that Olive Garden gift card, they technically need to declare the value of that as part of their income on their taxes. But as the church treasurer, if any time the church as a whole gives some type of gift to the pastor, the fair value of that, either if it was cash or gift card or if it's an item. The other year, when my husband completed 30 years of ministry, the church gave him the money for a guitar to as a gift for completing 30 years of service. That amount was taxable and had to be included on his W-2 because IRS looks at it, you're getting those gifts because of your role as the pastor, and so it's part of the income you're receiving. So if the church is directly doing that rather than just individual pieces, you got to include that on the W-2. When we have reimbursements for clergy, that is not reportable income. Anytime the clergy actually submits a mileage log or receipts for reimbursement, that is not reportable. Some churches have an account for the pastor to help with some of the expenses that, if they're buying books or different things, that they can turn in the receipts and get it reimbursed. None of that is taxable to the pastor. But I want you to be aware that property that was purchased, let's say there was books or curriculum that the pastor purchased. If the church gives that to the pastor to keep, let's say the pastor is being moved to a new church and the church is like, if you want to take that as part of your library, take it with you. We probably won't use it again. The fair value, the current purchase price, not purchase price, excuse me, the current fair value of that needs to be reported as part of the income because you're gifting that property. Anything that's reimbursed is property of the church. It's not the pastor's property. So if you let the pastor have it, you got to denote where they've received that amount, that value, as part of their income. For filing your W-2 forms, I got to be honest, the government wants everything e-filed nowadays. Our people who are in love with paper, it's not a good idea anymore. You can go to the Social Security Administration website to create an account and to e-file. You can technically still paper file, but I don't recommend it. E-filing really is your best way. Also, remember that these are due by the end of January, and technically you need to have it in their hands by the end of January. So you don't want to put this off much longer. Let me reword that. I have been blessed with these skills of working in taxes, and it's my desire to help support our churches and our conference any way I can. So please feel free to contact me. I have given you my office number here or my email address. I would love to help your church any way I can with tax issues. And as I said, this is part of my ministry of supporting our churches. Also, for further information, I encourage you to go to the irs.gov website for Pennsylvania, revenue.pa.gov, and also our own conference website. There is a document under the Finance and Administration area, Local Church Resources. It's a packet that's entitled Financial Information for Churches and Pastors. Now, it is dated. It was dated back in 2018, but the bulk of the information in there is still accurate, and it's a good resource, not just about dealing with clergy taxes, but other tax issues that churches need to be aware of. So it is another good resource to help you when you're looking at these tax items with clergy, but also with the church. Jason, can you think of other questions? or
Nancy, you did
concerns?
a great job presenting. Thank you so much. Just going to recap on some of the common questions that I get. You were referring to this form at annual conference where all the pastors' compensation is listed. What form is that?
That is the pastoral compensation form. Give me a second here and I'll re-show it to you again. Let me go back up to our very first slide. At not annual conference, at charge conference, use the right term here. This form that you see here on the left side of the screen, that is the actual pastoral compensation form that's filled out each year and approved by the church at charge conference. This is only page 1. It is a 2-page form. But this is where all the details of the pastor's compensation is worked out and approved. I've heard one DS refer to it as kind of like the contract between the pastor and the church for what's going to be paid.
Absolutely. And that's a really great way of wording it. Sometimes I've heard from payroll people or treasurers that they've not seen that form. That is form number 6. Where could I get it if I've not been given it?
You can go onto the conference website and find it under charge conference forms.
I'm sorry, the completed one from charge
Oh,
conference.
I always pester my church treasurer. Is there a way they can get it from the conference, or should they just get it from their treasurer?
Those are all options, certainly. If you're a payroll person, you can go to your church treasurer. You should be able to ask your pastor as well. But also all of these forms are remitted to the local district office, and then they've been sent to me. And I send out a compensation letter that kind of summarizes everything that is on that form 6. So all of those options, if you've never seen that form before, I would encourage them to search it out.
And I encourage pastors, if they're having their taxes done by a tax professional, to bring a copy of that with them to make sure that everybody's understanding what all's involved in the compensation.
Now, there is always confusion over the Social Security offset, and you did go over that. But that is cash that's paid to the pastor, and the money is reported in box 1, correct?
Correct. That is part of the cash salary.
So it should not be remitted to the federal government as FICA or Medicare.
Correct. And that is one big issue that is very much misunderstood all the time. That when we look at this form from the conference, that is our conference paperwork. That is not tax paperwork. And we need to understand that that's our internal language to call that Social Security tax offset. It's not the IRS's terms. To the IRS, that's just cash salary.
Beautiful. Now, moving down the housing, housing allowance, that's cash money that the pastor gets, but the parsonage value, I don't pay that to the pastor as cash, right?
Correct. That fair rental value is the value of them getting to live in the parsonage. And when I'm looking at the form, another misunderstanding that many people get from this form, when the pastor says, so what's the fair rental value? Often they jump to this item D on this form. Item D here is figuring an amount for what the church has to pay toward the pastor's pension. That again is an internal United Methodist figuring. That has nothing to do with the fair rental value of the parsonage. It's actually reported on the back side of this form in area G1.
Absolutely. And that was a confusion that I had from a payroll person yesterday who wondered, well, how am I supposed to pay the pastor another 25%? They already live in the parsonage. Yeah, not a concern that you have to worry yourself with.
Not at all.
You did a great job summarizing retirement contributions and the different ways that we would list those in box 12. If it's a 403B pre-tax, it's a code E. If it's a Roth or after-tax, it's a code BB. How would I find out which category it is? Do you know?
Well, if the pastor's not sure, I am sure you can help him with that one, Jason.
You're 100% correct. If there are questions, please contact me. I can look that up to see how it's been contributed. And if there's any conflict between what the pastor thinks they're contributing and what actually is the case, we can get that remedied with a very simple form. I think that is all the questions that I really get most often, that I spend most time talking about. Now, just another disclaimer here at the end. This was all about pastors who are under appointment, persons who are credentialed, licensed pastors, provisional elders and deacons, as well as fully ordained persons. CLMs and a district hire, how would I pay taxes on them, Nancy?
They would be treated like a normal employee, and they
Okay,
would not have all these tax benefits. They don't get to um, take advantage of anything with the parsonage and all. I mean, if something like that's provided, it would be their package would need to be looked at as just a regular employee's package. You would have to withhold FICA taxes. If someone doesn't fall under the clergy di- distinction, they should be treated like a normal employee and their wages and compensation package just like you would any other employee.
certainly. And just for everyone's benefit, those employees do not fill out a Form 6 that looks like theirs. Theirs looks very different. We have a special one for CLMs and DS hires that looks very different. And so if the Form 6 doesn't look like this one, they're probably considered to be a lay employee. So,
Correct.
well, Nancy, unless you have anything else.
My contact information, please feel free to contact me. I believe, Jason, you're going to post the PDF of these slides for people when we
Yep.
post this.
The video and the slides will all be available on the website and in the email. And certainly, if you have any questions, you can reach out to Nancy or myself. Nancy, thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you for your time. I hope you have a wonderful and safe weekend with the snow coming.
Yes.
And I pray that you have a peaceful tax season.
Oh, we hope so. Thank you for
Absolutely.
the opportunity, Jason.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye bye.